Okay, my friends.
The first time I realized something was wrong, my card didn't decline with a beep. It declined with a little message that sounded almost polite. Access restricted. I tried the second card, then the third, because habits die hard, and so do illusions. Maris didn't ask what happened. She just washed my hands, the way you watch a man check a lock that's been changed. When I opened the banking app, the password had been reset. The recovery email wasn't mine anymore, and the phone number on file had been updated. A clean little theft, dressed up as help. Our daughter, Briar, texted like she was sending a weather update. Don't worry. I took over the finances. It's safer this way. I stared at the screen and felt something cold settle in my chest. Not panic, not confusion, clarity, the kind you get when someone shows you exactly what they think you are. Subscribe, hit the like button, and tell me in the comments how old you are and where you're from. For you, it's just a small thing. But for me, it's the reason I keep telling these stories. Maris gave a small, almost amused exhale and said, "So, we've been demoted to children." I didn't raise my voice, because raising your voice is what you do when you're negotiating. I wasn't negotiating. I called Briar once. One clean ring. Then I ended it myself, because I wanted my silence to be chosen, not forced. I've worked with contracts, deadlines, and people who smile while they reach for your wallet. The trick is always the same. They create urgency, so you'll surrender. Briar was betting we'd come crawling within hours, embarrassed, asking for help, and she could stand over us like a hero in her own movie. That night, I made coffee the way I always do, steady, measured, and I watched Maris move through the kitchen with calm precision, like she was taking inventory of a room that had just become a battleground. I even let myself a quiet joke, because sometimes humor is a blade. If Briar wanted to be our banker, she should have at least offered a toaster. We didn't ask friends, we didn't call relatives, we didn't announce a crisis. Because the moment you broadcast weakness, someone always offers you a leash instead of a hand. And while Briar waited for our desperate call, we did something she hadn't planned for. We started making decisions she would never be invited into. The next morning, Briar sent another message, shorter, sharper, less responsible. I read it twice, then looked at Maris, because I could already feel where this was going, and I wasn't going to rush a single step. By morning, Briar's tone had changed from protective to administrative, which is always the first mask people wear when they want power without responsibility. She sent a list. Yes, a list of what she'd handled for us. Bills paused, accounts consolidated, spending limits set, like she was reorganizing a garage instead of two grown lives. I read it slowly, not because it was complicated, but because haste would have been a gift to her. Maris asked if I wanted eggs or oatmeal, and I said oatmeal, then realized we were out, and laughed, because irony has timing like that. We ate toast instead, dry but honest, and I thought, this is how control starts, small inconveniences wrapped in good intentions. I replied to Briar with one sentence. Received. No questions, no objections, no panic, just a receipt, the kind you keep when you're preparing a return. An hour later, my phone buzzed again, this time with a cheerful follow-up asking if we needed anything, which is code for "Are you breaking yet?" I didn't answer, because silence isn't absence. It's pressure applied evenly. I spent the afternoon sorting papers in my study, finding things I hadn't needed in years, and smiling at how often people confuse quiet preparation with surrender. At one point, I knocked over a stack of envelopes, cursed under my breath, and Maris said, "Careful, she might start managing gravity next." We laughed, low and controlled, the way you do when you know the joke is temporary but the lesson will last. By evening, Briar called. Not texted, her voice too bright, too quick, like a doorbell pressed twice. She said she was worried that we'd gone unusually quiet, and I could hear the math in her head not adding up. I told her we were fine, thanked her for her concern, and ended the call before she could ask the question she was really calling to ask. Because the moment she realized we weren't frightened, something else began to surface, and it wasn't concern. That night, Maris and I sat in the living room without the TV on, listening to the house settle. And somewhere across town, our daughter started to feel the first flicker of something she hadn't expected at all: uncertainty. The first real inconvenience arrived quietly, the way disrespect usually does. Our pharmacy called to say a routine refill had been paused pending authorization, which is a polite way of telling you someone else is holding the pen. I thanked the clerk, hung up, and told Maris we'd take a walk instead, because frustration burns off better when your legs are moving and your mouth is closed. On the sidewalk, Maris joked that at least if we fainted dramatically, Briar would finally have paperwork to file. I smiled, because humor keeps your hands steady while you plan. Back home, I opened an old ledger I hadn't touched in years, the one people assume is sentimental clutter. It turns out nostalgia makes an excellent filing system. I realized then how neatly Briar had overreached. She blocked what she could see, not what she didn't know existed. When she called that afternoon, her voice had lost its warmth and gained a thin edge, like a knife that hadn't been sharpened properly. She asked why the pharmacy was calling her, why vendors were confused, why things weren't going according to plan. I said, calmly, that when you move fast without permission, you trip over details, and I let the silence do the rest of the talking. Maris, listening nearby, raised an eyebrow and mouthed vendors, as if we were a failing restaurant. After the call, I tried fixing a loose cabinet hinge, dropped the screw twice, and decided that even revolutions need coffee breaks. What bothered me wasn't the blocked money. It was the certainty in Briar's tone that this was already settled, that our role had been reassigned without a meeting. I've seen that confidence before, right before someone learns the difference between access and ownership. By evening, messages from Briar stacked up, each one shorter, less polite, more urgent, like footsteps getting closer in a dark hallway. She still believed this was about control. She hadn't yet realized it was about timing, and that her clock had already started running. The escalation didn't come with shouting. It came with a calendar invite Briar sent titled Financial Check-In. Nothing says respect like scheduling your parents' autonomy between a dentist appointment and lunch. I declined it without comment, then accidentally accepted a spam invite about discount windows, which felt symbolic enough to keep. Briar called 5 minutes later, irritation wrapped in politeness, asking why I'd declined something important. I told her we already had plans at that time, plans being a useful word when you don't know details. She sighed the way people do when they think patience makes them superior and said she was trying to help us avoid mistakes. I asked which mistakes she meant, and the pause on the line was long enough to be educational. Maris passed by with a laundry basket, tripped on the rug, caught herself, and said, "Careful, apparently we're not insured for independent movement anymore." That got a laugh out of me, short and sharp, because humor is cheaper than anger and lasts longer. Briar shifted tactics and mentioned legal responsibility, a phrase people use when they're bluffing with vocabulary. I reminded her, gently, that responsibility without consent is just trespassing in a nicer coat. She warned that banks don't like complications, and I said banks like signatures even less. After the call, I checked the mailbox and found a letter addressed to Briar at our house, forwarded, presumptive, already settling in. I didn't open it. I placed it on the table where decisions go to wait. That evening, I noticed Maris had labeled the pantry shelves again, an old habit from raising kids, and we both laughed at the idea that order equals obedience. Across town, Briar started calling people she shouldn't have involved. And that was the moment her private little takeover began to attract witnesses she couldn't control. The humiliation didn't arrive as an insult. It arrived disguised as concern from a third party. A man from our bank called and asked, carefully, almost apologetically, whether we were aware that our daughter was now speaking on our behalf. I told him I was very aware of many things, and silence, again, did the heavy lifting. He cleared his throat and said Briar had used phrases like declining capacity and temporary oversight, which told me she practiced them in the mirror. Maris overheard and muttered, temporary oversight, like when you forget where you parked, not where your life went. I thanked the banker, assured him everything would be clarified shortly, and hung up before he could suggest guardianship like it was a courtesy upgrade. What stung wasn't the words. It was the confidence Briar had borrowing our dignity like a credit card. I spent the afternoon fixing a squeaky door hinge that had been annoying me for years, slipped with the screwdriver, and left a neat little dent. Proof that even control has texture. Maris teased that at this rate, Briar would soon manage home repairs remotely. When Briar finally showed up in person, she stood in the doorway like a manager visiting an underperforming branch. She didn't ask how we were. She asked if we'd calmed down, as if autonomy were a tantrum. I invited her to sit, not because she deserved comfort, but because seated people talk longer and listen less carefully. She explained her actions with rehearsed warmth, saying she couldn't risk us making bad decisions, and I nodded like a man watching someone walk confidently toward thin ice. Inside, something hardened, not anger, but resolve, the kind that forms when respect is replaced with procedure. She left that evening convinced she'd asserted authority. What she didn't notice was how carefully Maris and I watched her touch nothing she actually owned. That night, sleep came easily, which surprised me, because clarity is quieter than worry. I lay there thinking about how often authority mistakes familiarity for ownership, and how children grow bold when they believe history has expired. In the morning, I tried paying a small utility bill online, watched it fail, and nodded, because confirmation is useful when you're building a case. Maris asked if I wanted coffee, then realized we'd run out filters and laughed, saying, "Good thing independence isn't paper-based." We drove to the store anyway, paid cash, and I enjoyed the old rhythm of it. The clerk counting bills, the receipt tearing cleanly, simple things that don't ask permission. Back home, I found an email from Briar's husband, calder, polite, and distant, asking if we'd considered cooperating for everyone's peace of mind. I appreciated the phrasing. Nothing reveals alignment like shared vocabulary. I replied with a single line, "We are considering everything." Around noon, a neighbor waved and asked if Briar had moved back in, because her car had been seen idling nearby earlier in the week. I smiled and said families sometimes circle before they land, then spent 10 minutes looking for my glasses while wearing them, which felt like a fair reminder that attention beats speed. What pressed on me wasn't fear. It was the insult of being managed by people who'd never balanced more than optimism and debt. I opened a drawer Maris and I hadn't touched in years and checked what was still where it should be. It was, because foresight ages well. By late afternoon, Briar sent a message asking for a meeting to reset expectations, and I felt the moment tighten like a knot pulled too fast. I told Maris we wouldn't be rushing anything, and she nodded, already understanding that pressure makes people reveal what they're hiding. We ate dinner quietly, not out of distance, but focus, and I noticed how calm feels heavier when it's deliberate. By the time the sun set, I knew Briar had crossed from confidence into urgency. And urgency, I've learned, is where mistakes finally begin to speak. By the seventh day, the anger finally arrived, but it was quiet, settled, and very useful. It wasn't the kind that tightens your chest or makes you reckless. It was the kind that straightens your posture and sharpens your memory. I watched Briar's messages stack up without opening them, each notification softer than the last, as if volume alone could replace authority. Maris caught me rereading an old folder of documents and said, "You look like a man revisiting a promise he kept." I told her I was just checking my handwriting, because some signatures age better than faces. That morning I tried fixing the kitchen clock that had been slow for years, adjusted it the wrong way, and made it even slower, proof that rushing has never been my strength and never needed to be. Briar finally called, voice tight, asking why we were doing this, as if silence were a provocation instead of a boundary. I told her we weren't doing anything at all, which confused her more than shouting ever could. She accused us of being stubborn, of making things harder than they needed to be, and I realized she was describing herself without knowing it. I reminded her, calmly, that control taken without consent always comes back with interest. There was a pause, then a sharp inhale, the sound of someone realizing their leverage is mostly imaginary. Maris walked by, tapped the table twice, a signal between us older than arguments, and I knew we were aligned without a word. After the call ended, I felt that internal shift people mistake for exhaustion, but is actually commitment settling into place. This wasn't about money anymore. It was about the moment you decide whether someone else gets to rewrite your role while you're still standing in the room. I stood by the window and watched the street, patient, certain, aware that something was already moving toward us. Because while Briar believed she was waiting us out, we were waiting for the exact moment she'd have no choice but to show her hand.
I knew the week had finally broken her when Briar stopped texting like a manager and started texting like a daughter pretending to be calm. That tone always arrives late, after control slips, but before pride admits it. I watched my husband fold the newspaper with unnecessary precision, which told me he was already 3 steps ahead and enjoying the patience of it. People think silence is passive. They've never lived with a man who uses it as a measuring tool. I made soup that morning and forgot the salt, then laughed at myself, because even plans don't need to be perfect when timing is. Briar called me directly, skipping him, which was her first mistake of the day. She asked if we were okay, stretching the word like it might catch on something sharp. I told her we were exactly as okay as people tend to be when they aren't being rushed into begging. She said she was coming by to check on things, and I let the pause linger just long enough to remind her whose house she was talking about. When she arrived, her car sat in the driveway like it belonged there, confident, temporary, already overstaying. She walked in and glanced around as if the walls might report to her, and I almost smiled. I offered her tea, not kindness, just habit, and she declined like someone afraid to sit too long. She talked quickly, explaining again why she'd taken control, why it was necessary, why we should understand, and I noticed she never once asked for permission. At one point, she knocked over her own purse, papers spilling out, and froze like the mess had betrayed her authority. I helped her gather them calmly and said, "Careful, control looks slippery when it's dropped." She left with less certainty than she arrived with, and she knew it. Because for the first time, she understood she wasn't managing parents anymore. She was standing in front of 2 people who had already decided how this would end. After Briar left, the house felt larger, not emptier, like space reclaimed instead of abandoned. I wiped the counter she hadn't touched because restoring order has nothing to do with cleaning and everything to do with intent. That afternoon, I received a call from a woman at the bank who spoke slowly, carefully, as if pace itself were a courtesy. She asked whether we had requested that our daughter be granted full financial control, emphasizing the word the way professionals do when they already know the answer. I told her no, and then added that no one had ever requested our consent at all, which caused a pause heavy enough to matter. She thanked me, said documentation would be revisited, and I pictured folders shifting quietly where Briar thought they were fixed in place. My husband tried making tea later and forgot the kettle on the stove, filling the kitchen with steam and an apology grin that reminded me why impatience never suited him. We laughed because even small missteps feel lighter when the direction is right. By evening, Briar texted again, this time asking if we'd spoken to any representatives, which told me exactly who had spoken to her. I replied that we speak to people when we choose to and never under supervision. She called immediately, her voice lower now, careful, as if each word might trigger something irreversible. She warned us about complications, about how things could get difficult, and I realized she was afraid of losing the narrative more than the control. I told her difficulty isn't something you threaten people with after they've survived decades of consequences. There was silence on the line, then a soft, frustrated sound I hadn't heard since she was a teenager caught in a lie. When the call ended, I felt something shift, not relief, but alignment, like pieces settling into the place they were always meant to occupy. That night, my husband said, quietly, that tomorrow would matter. And for the first time, I knew Briar understood that waiting us out was no longer an option. The next morning unfolded with an unusual politeness, the kind that only appears before a confrontation chooses its posture. My husband set the table and placed the sugar bowl on the wrong side, then corrected it without comment, which told me he was thinking several moves ahead. At 9 a.m. exactly, Briar's car pulled into our driveway again, same confidence, less certainty. She didn't knock this time. She rang the bell and stepped back, as if distance might soften what she was about to hear. I opened the door slowly, not to make a point, but to let her settle into the moment she couldn't rush anymore. She said she'd brought paperwork, held it up like a shield, and smiled too tightly for it to be real. I invited her in and said nothing, because silence makes documents feel heavier in the hands that hold them. She spread the papers on the table, explaining timelines and safeguards, and I noticed how often she avoided my husband's eyes. At one point, she asked if we were finally ready to be practical, and I almost laughed at the irony of the word. My husband leaned back, listened, then reached for his glasses and cleaned them carefully, buying time the way experienced people do. I told Breyer practicality doesn't begin with locking doors, it begins with asking who lives inside the house. Her voice wavered, just slightly, as she insisted she was acting in our best interest, a phrase that never survives inspection. She glanced at the clock, then at us, as if time itself might take her side. I poured coffee and missed the cup by a fraction, splashing the saucer, and said dryly, "That's what happens when you assume alignment." The room tightened, not with anger, but recognition as Breyer realized the meeting wasn't going where she'd planned. She gathered her papers faster than she'd laid them out, thanked us too formally, and left with a look that lingered on the door frame. Because she could feel it now, the balance had shifted, and the next move wouldn't be hers to make. The confrontation didn't announce itself. It slipped in through a phone call from someone Breyer hadn't warned us about. A lawyer, measured voice, careful pauses, asked whether we were aware of temporary authority arrangements made on our behalf. I told him we were aware of an attempt, not an arrangement, and that words matter when signatures don't exist. He paused long enough for the truth to catch up, then asked if we would be available to clarify matters in writing. I said we already had, which confused him in the most productive way. After the call, my husband tried to staple a thin stack of papers and jammed the stapler, muttering that even tools protest sloppy planning. We fixed it together, laughing softly, because teamwork is louder than panic. By noon, Breyer arrived again, unannounced, her confidence replaced by urgency dressed as reason. She said this was getting out of hand, which is what people say when the hand they're holding slips free. I told her the only thing out of hand was control taken without consent, and I kept my voice level so the words would land clean. She accused us of embarrassing her, of making her look reckless, and I realized she'd finally named the real fear. My husband stood, adjusted a picture frame she'd bumped earlier, and said nothing, his silence cutting straighter than any lecture. Breyer's eyes moved between us, searching for the weak link she used to know and finding none. I offered her a chair. She refused, because sitting would have meant listening. When she left, she forgot her folder on the table and had to come back for it, cheeks flushed, authority thinning by the step. As her car disappeared down the street, I felt the pressure crust. Because once embarrassment enters the room, control is never far behind, and it never leaves intact. The threat arrived wrapped in reassurance, which is how people test whether fear still listens to them. Breyer called that evening and said we needed to think about long-term arrangements, stressing the phrase like it carried weight by itself. She mentioned care facilities, support structures, contingencies, words meant to shrink a room without moving a single wall. I listened carefully because threats reveal more than arguments ever do. My husband sat nearby trying to open a stubborn jar, lost the grip, and said dryly, "If this thing puts up any more resistance, we'll need a mediator." I smiled and told Breyer that long-term thinking is exactly why we don't rush into short-sighted control. She warned us that if we didn't cooperate, things could become official, a word that people use when they want gravity without authority. I reminded her that official processes begin with consent, not convenience. There was a pause, then her voice dropped, sharp and tired, asking why we were doing this to her. I answered honestly, we weren't doing anything to her, we were simply not surrendering for her. After the call, my husband finally opened the jar and declared victory with a small bow, because even small wins matter when pressure builds. Later, I reviewed documents we'd prepared weeks ago, long before Breyer believed she was improvising, and felt that calm certainty settle deeper. This wasn't about being protected, it was about being replaced. And once you see that clearly, hesitation disappears. When night came, I slept lightly but peacefully, knowing the next day would demand decisions she wasn't ready to face. Because the moment Breyer tried to make our future smaller, she unknowingly stepped into a space we had already secured. The breaking point didn't come with noise, it came with presence. That morning, as we were returning home just after 9, Breyer's car was already parked in our driveway, engine cold, positioned too neatly, as if placement could replace permission. My husband slowed the car slightly, not to hesitate, but to observe, and said, almost amused, "She's early." That's new. When we walked inside, Briar was standing in the living room, arms folded, wearing the expression of someone ready to resolve things without asking how. She said we had to talk now because delays were creating problems, and I thought how urgency always belongs to the person losing ground. My husband set his keys down carefully, missed the bowl by an inch, and shrugged. Gravity's been unreliable lately, which broke the tension just enough to expose it. Briar announced she'd contacted people, gathered opinions, and was prepared to move forward whether we liked it or not. I asked her, calmly, who exactly had given her the authority to move anything that didn't belong to her. She faltered, just for a second, then doubled down, saying she was our daughter and that should be enough. I told her being our daughter gave her a place in our lives, not ownership over them. My husband finally spoke, quietly, explaining that control taken without consent doesn't age well, and neither do lies built for convenience. Briar's voice rose, not loud, but sharp, accusing us of planning behind her back. I didn't deny it. I simply said we planned ahead, something she mistook for weakness. The room went still in that way that precedes irreversible understanding. As Briar stood there, realizing the ground beneath her had shifted days ago, she finally sensed what we had known all along: the next move was no longer hers to make. The end didn't look like a victory scene from a movie, it looked like clarity settling into place. I told Briar to sit down, not as a command, but as an invitation to finally listen instead of perform. She hesitated, then sat, because confidence without leverage eventually gets tired. My husband slid a thin folder across the table, missed the edge slightly, corrected it, and said, "We prepared for this years ago. You just arrived late." Inside were documents she had never seen, decisions already finalized, safeguards already activated, signatures placed long before she imagined herself in charge. Her face changed, not dramatically, but deeply, the way it does when someone realizes the story they've been telling themselves is no longer believable. She asked why we hadn't told her, and I answered simply that trust doesn't require supervision, and autonomy doesn't ask permission to exist. There was no shouting, no accusations, just the quiet collapse of an illusion she'd built too quickly. My husband stood, knocked his knee lightly against the table, winced at himself, and said dryly, careful, "Furniture remembers who owns it." That small moment broke the tension completely, because humor lands hardest when power has already shifted. Briar gathered her things slowly this time, no rush left to hide behind, and apologized, not eloquently, but honestly enough to matter. We accepted it without celebration, because dignity doesn't need applause. When she left, the house felt exactly as it always had: steady, grounded, ours. That evening, my husband and I sat quietly, not exhausted, not triumphant, just aligned in the way people are when they've stood their ground without losing themselves. They didn't break. They stood their ground and won.